Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a grandson by the name of Jared, and I invited Jared and my other grandchildren to Toys R Us, and everybody got a toy except for Jared. And I said, sweetheart, buy yourself a toy. Grandpa and I want you to have a toy. He said, I can't because they don't have anything for my hobby. So I said, what's your hobby? He said, I can't tell you because you'll tell my mother. I said, no, I won't. He was 5 years old. What could this hobby be? So let me just hide this. He said, I like to collect Victoria's Secret catalogs. I said, what do you want that for? I had a picture of him wearing a brassiere underneath his Little League uniform. He said, oh, Grandma, I love to look at the pictures of the naked ladies in their underwear. He was 5 years old and he was already interested in looking at the naked ladies in their underwear. I thought they should lock him in his room till he went to military school. My husband is much more sophisticated than I, and he said not to be too hard on poor Jared. It wasn't his fault. Sex is hardwired into our biology. We have no choice. It's nature's way of making sure that although you and I are only temporary, the species goes on as a whole. So from the time we're 5 years old until grandma meets somebody in the nursing home, we are very interested in sex. And we humans are the superstars in the animal kingdom sexually. In the year 1900, there were only 1 billion of us. Today, there are 7 billion. They say that by 2061, there'll be 10 billion people. And here's a picture of God, and he's saying, are you sure? I only remember creating 2 of them. So we got more than that now. So we may be the sexual superstars in the animal kingdom, but in the plant kingdom, it is the orchid that is the sexual superstar. Evolving over 100 million years ago as the last of the flowering plants, orchids have been so spectacularly successful in their sexual strategy that they absolutely carpet the globe. People talk about orchids as though they were rare and unusual, but they're not. Fully 10% of all flowering plant species is an orchid. We find them on every continent on Earth and every environment except Antarctica. Some of them are so little, like Platystelli misera, that a bouquet of them can fit on your fingernail. Some of them are huge, like Grammatophyllum speciosum, which is bigger than a bull elephant. About the majority of them live as epiphytes on trees. About 5% of them live as lithophytes on rocks, and the rest live as terrestrials in the ground. You can find them at the top of telephone poles or on electrical boxes near your house. They grow under bridges in Bolivia. They've even found their way to our food supply. Most people don't know that vanilla comes from an orchid. And I was at the Dior counter in Neiman Marcus, and a lady was trying to sell me a cream called Sublimage for $420. And I said, what could be in this cream that I would pay $420? My whole face isn't worth more than $100 tops. So she says, oh, it has a very rare ingredient, vanilla planifolia. And I said, well, that's not a rare ingredient. That's in vanilla extract. Could I just like open up a bottle and like splash it on my face? It was not a big hit at the Dior counter. Orchids are even found in places you wouldn't expect them. This is Epipactis gigantea, which grows in Las Vegas. And we go every year with my club to see the stands of Epipactis gigantea, which grow anywhere there's a little water. And actually at our university, there was a leak in the water fountain. And underneath the leak in the water fountain, in the puddle, grew a stand of Epipactis gigantea, its seeds blown in by the wind. And here one of our members took a picture of the surfeit fly carrying pollinia, the little masses of pollen from this Epipactis gigantea. Orchids are even found underneath the ground. This is Rhizoanthella gardneri from Western Australia. It grows completely under the ground and it's pollinated by a termite. So orchids are so successful in their sexual strategy that you find them from the top of the telephone poles to the bottom of the earth. Orchids have always been associated with sex. The name orchid itself means testicle in Latin and Greek, because many orchids die back to the ground every year and they store food and energy for next year's growth in these tubers like potatoes. And because of what they looked like, they were called orchids. And here is Orchis mascula, and you can see what the tubers look like. And orchids have throughout history been associated with sex. This picture is by Edouard Manet, the Impressionist, and she's called Olympia. And when it was displayed in 1865 at the Paris Salon, it caused a sensation. And not because she was nude, you know, the French are okay with that. It was because she has an orchid in her hair, and that meant she was a prostitute. And during the 17th century, in the Dutch golden age of landscape painting, they painted every kind of flower, but they never painted an orchid because everybody knew that orchids were too fresh to be painted. The Romans associated orchids with sex. They told the story of their demigod Orcus, and he was invited to the birthday party of Bacchus, Dionysus. And he got very drunk at that party and he raped a virgin priestess. And for that, he was chopped in little pieces and thrown all over the world. And his mother came to the gods and said, "What have you done?" And to console her, the gods decided that everywhere his body went, they would make a beautiful orchid grow. And that was the Roman explanation for the widespread orchid. But notice, even 2,500 years ago, orchids were associated with something sexual and something indiscreet. The Chinese also associated orchids with sex. They told the story of their emperor Shokati and his beautiful wife, Yoki Hai. And they had everything they wanted in life, but she was barren. And one day she was crying as she did and walking in the woods, lamenting her fate. And all of a sudden she caught the fragrance, just the fragrance of the orchid Cymbidium and Cephalium. And she immediately got pregnant. And moments later, she gave birth to 13 full-grown and very handsome sons. This is a true story. But the Chinese associated orchids, they were so powerful, just the smell could make you pregnant. The orchid sex connection was clinched in the 1st century AD by a writer called Dioscorides, who wrote a very influential early medical text. And he said that if something looked like a body part, it must be good for curing that body part. So if an apple looks like the heart, then it must be good for curing the heart. And if a walnut looks like the brain, it must be good for curing the brain. Well, because of what this looked like, it was used for thousands of years, and it is still used today as a kind of Viagra. It's used in childbirth and for fertility. And in Turkey today, they make an ice cream out of these tubers, and they dry them and they grind them with sugar and cream, and they whip it, and they make an ice cream called dondurma. It comes in 32 flavors. It doesn't melt. You eat it with a knife and fork. You can skip rope with it. And the men line up around the block in order to have this frozen Viagra. And it is in such demand that it is actually making the orchids like Orchis extinct, because one ice cream manufacturer will destroy 12 million orchids a year to make this very popular dessert. They also make a drink called salep in the Middle East. It used to be very popular all over Europe before coffee and tea. There is in London a salop street, and salep means fox's testicles because of what they thought that the orchid tubers looked like. And so they make a drink and a pudding, and here it is in Hebrew, it says salep. So these things have always been associated with helping male vigor. So when we want to have sex and pass on our genes, we have no problem. We go on a date, we fall in love, hopefully we get married, but we don't have any trouble with the transfer of our genetic material because we're more mobile. The problem of the orchid is that it's stuck in the ground and the male cannot drive over his contribution to the next generation to the female. So they have to enlist the aid of a third party, a truck driver, an Amazon delivery man, the FedEx man, the birds and the bees. So every orchid sex is a ménage à trois, the two orchids and the pollinator. So when an orchid wants to complete a sexual transaction, it's not looking to attract another orchid. It's looking to attract a pollinator, a different species in a completely different kingdom. And here you see the orchid has attracted a euglossine bee, which is carrying the male pollen or pollinia. And orchids will do anything in order to get pollinated. They will lie, they will cheat, they will promise and not deliver. If they do deliver, they give as little as possible. Does this remind you of anybody? But orchids are clever and resourceful, which is why they are so successful. And here we have a piece of amber that was on the cover of Nature magazine. It's 15 million years old. And here you can see the bee pollinator. And so you get the Amazon driver and what he's carrying. This is an old form of orchid pollinia. It is very unusual to find a fossil of a pollinator and what he is carrying. It's from the Dominican Republic. So one of the ways of attracting a pollinator is being visually attractive. And we do this too. We go on diets and we wear sexy clothes and high heels and makeup because we think that if we're cute, we'll do better in the mating game. Well, orchids do that too. They try to be visually attractive. But think for a moment, what the orchid is trying to attract is somebody like this. It's completely different from the orchid. And even the eyes are different. This is a fly's eyes, and it's got thousands of these little facets, each one getting a little picture of the orchid. So what does a fly think is attractive? What's interesting is this is Spiranthes ramanziffiana, and they did an experiment where they took a whole bunch of these and put them on a table, and they asked people to say which one was the most attractive. And oddly, the ones that people thought were the most attractive also got the most visits from pollinators. So perhaps beauty is a little more universal than even we know. And this is the sort of thing that attracts a pollinator. Yellow is the color of pollen. The orchid's eye, the pollinator's eye can especially see these spots. This is an orchid that is visually attractive. It is Bulbophyllum lemniscatoides. Let me just do this. Bulbophyllum lemniscatoides, and it's pollinated by a fly. Flies lay their eggs in a medium that allows them, the larvae, to grow. This orchid looks like baby flies, we think, and these streamers, called palliae, look like maggots. And if the wind moves or the humidity changes, these things wriggle. And we think that the fly coming by says, oh, look, there's all these flies and maggots. This is a good place to lay my eggs. The eggs will perish because this is not a good place to lay your eggs. It's false advertising, but the orchid will get pollinated as the fly rummages around. Liars and cheats. Let me just do this. Now, when I want a man to be attracted to me, I don't want him to look at my heel. I want him to look where I want him to look to get the best effect. So the same thing happens with orchids. This Cattleya purpurata that they used to call Laelia, it's got these lines on it, these guidelines. And the pollinator is guided right into the sexual part because of these visual lines and by this interesting color. And it's very much like the lights on a runway in an airport that tells the plane exactly where to go. So orchids paint a target on themselves. Color is very important in attracting a pollinator. We know that some men like blondes and some like brunettes or redheads, and who knows why. Well, pollinators like a lot of different colors. We know that hummingbirds are especially attracted to orange and red, which is why we put them in our hummingbird feeder. And they say that if you stand in the middle of a field and open your mouth and fill your mouth with a red slushy, that hummingbirds will come and feed out of your mouth, which is just a little tip in case you have few hours free. Well, bees are attracted to all the other colors. However, they also can see, because of their eye receptors, ultraviolet light. We can't see it. So this is what a daisy we see. This is what the daisy looks like under ultraviolet light. This is what we see. This is under ultraviolet light. This is not an orchid, but notice that under ultraviolet light, the pollinator can see all these guidelines. So it's important for you to know that there is advertising to the pollinator, which can see ultraviolet light that we cannot see. Different colors are attractive to different pollinators. Yellow is particularly irresistible to bees and wasps. It's the color of pollen, and pollen is the Dr. Atkins protein bar of the orchid world. They feed it to their babies, they make muscle out of it, and the bee really cannot resist flowers that are yellow. Orchids, because they package all their pollen in one package, does not allow the pollinator to eat the pollen. So many orchids paint false pollen on themselves. These are just a bunch of hairs, but it's pseudo pollen. And the bee will come over attempting to eat this, which is false advertising, and will pollinate the Calypso bulbosa. Butterflies love pastel colors. And here we have a kind of butterfly, a skipper butterfly, and you can see the pollinia stuck to his proboscis, and he likes these pastel colors. We know that hummingbirds love these red tubular flowers. Interestingly, about hummingbirds, birds are very clean. And if you have a bird, you know they don't like stuff on their beak. Well, if the hummingbird got yellow pollinia, he would wipe it off his beak. They don't like anything on their beak. And that would be reproductive disaster for the orchid. So orchids that are pollinated by hummingbirds produce a pollen that is the same color as the bird's beak. So hummingbird pollinated orchids have blue or gray pollinia, which is very different. Moths love white flowers. Moths come out at night, and white can often be seen in moonlight. And so when there is no moon, the flowers still are very fragrant so that the pollinator can find it at night, even if there is no moon. Flies like icky colors, like this maroon, the color of death, the color of rotting meat and rotting things. And this Phragmipedium caudatum, which attracts flies, which eat and lay their eggs in rotting things, is the color of rotting things. One of the ways in which orchids, the most outrageous way in which orchids attract the pollinator, is through sexual deception. So orchids are the masters of deception in the plant world. There are other flowers which are deceptive, but 85% of deceptive plant species are orchids. 1/3 of the approximately 30,000 orchid species promise something which they either cannot or will not deliver. In Europe, half of the orchids are deceptive. In Australia, most of the orchids are deceptive. So what sexual deception entails is the flower attempts to look like and smell like a female insect in need of a little male companionship. So here we have Orchis insectivora, looking very much like an insect, all furry and the same shape. And it produces a fragrance, which is very important. It's the fragrance of their female. And this orchid has attracted not one, not two, but 3 sex-crazed males wanting to copulate with this flower. So here was what happens. This is actually an orchid. It's Orchis bumbuliflora. It looks like a bumblebee. Orchis in Latin means eyebrow. This thing is hairy like a bee. It has a ridge, which is the same ridge as around the genitals of the female solitary bees. Looks like it's got a nose and eyes. I mean, it's amazing. So it is pollinated by naive male bees in Europe and the Middle East. And these bees come out of the ground and they come out, the males come out 2 weeks earlier than the females. And there are twice as many males as females. And the females will only mate once in their lives. And these bees come out, they're very, very desperate. They want to get one of those females. And they see this orchid and it looks pretty good. It smells even better. And for a naive, inexperienced male, she doesn't fly away. She's easy. So he mounts the orchid and he falls for the trick and he rocks back and forth and back and forth and back. And because she's a flower and not a real girl, he gets frustrated and he flies away. And not before he picks up the pollen from the orchid, the pollinia. But because he's not Einstein, he falls for the trick again and he deposits the pollen. And here you see he's pulled out the pollinia. And this is the pollinia that has been deposited in a female. They call this pseudo-copulation, false copulation. But remember, it's only false for the bee. The bee doesn't score, but the orchid does. The orchid completes its sexual procedure. And I have a little video here. Tell me if you hear it, okay?
Some
Do you
plants,
hear it?
however, do not give
Yes,
their
it's working.
pollinators any reward of any kind. In the warmer parts of Europe lives a whole group that bamboozle their pollinators into thinking that they're going to get a really sensational reward, a sexual one. They're little orchids, and their flowers reproduce remarkably closely the signals that enable a male bee or wasp to recognize a female of the same species. Several have blue patches. One is fringed with what looks like fur. A wasp's wings, in the right light, do flash iridescent blue, and its abdomen is covered with thick brown fur. A female wasp also pumps out an identifying perfume, but the orchid does the same, and the result is irresistible. As the male wasp nuzzles forward in his attempts to mate, he butts the pollinia which stick to him like yellow horns. He seems to be well aware that something has happened to him, but there's nothing he can do about it, and he flies off to try his luck elsewhere. Which, of course, is what the orchid requires, because this time he deposits the pollen on another bogus female. The hairs on many of these orchids run downwards, as though the female is sitting with her head up. But some reproduce her clinging head down, and then the male must land that way if he wants to mate, and he will get the pollen stuck to his rear. This one too seems fully aware that he's got rather more than he bargained for. The orchid's mimicry is so convincing and enticing that sometimes a flower will attract a whole scrum of sex-crazed suitors. Some are trying to get to the orchid and will inadvertently deliver the pollen. Other males, since there seems to be a full house, attempt to mate with one another.
There you go. Amazing. In Australia, almost all the terrestrial orchids are deceptive. And among the more interesting ones are the Dracea orchids. And the Dracea, here you have a male wasp, and this is an orchid, and it's got a hinge here. And this mimics the female of the thinid wasps. And the female has no wings. She never flies in her life. She spends her whole life in the ground eating beetle grubs. It's no life. For 4 days of her life, she climbs up on a shrub. She sends out her pheromone. And within 2 minutes, because there's such competition for these females, a male jumps on the female thinid wasp. He picks her up and he takes her for a honeymoon. He copulates with her. He gives her some food and he puts her down on the shrub. That's her whole social life for her whole life. The most important part is the fragrance. The fragrance exactly matches the exact species of thinid wasp. So it's a very specific relationship. This is Dracea glyptodon. It produces one tiny fragrance that only this species of wasp is turned on by. And somebody named Staudemeyer put some of these Dracea orchids in his back seat where the wasps couldn't see them, and they flew in through the window, even though they couldn't see them, attracted by the sexual pheromone produced by the orchid. And here you have a picture of the female wasp without her wings. And this is what happens. He sees this female and he smells her. He's lured in by the dummy female. Step one, he goes on here and he's trying to take her up for a honeymoon, but she's not going anywhere. And there's a hinge here. And the hinge pushes him forward. Over he goes, delivering the pollen. Lover boy falls for the trick and pollinates the orchid. And the problem is, because this orchid is pollinated only by each species by one specific fungus and has one specific pollinator, and the female eats only one specific beetle larvae, 5 of the 10 species of Dracea are now threatened, and one of them is extinct. So having such a fancy and specific pollination syndrome puts you a little bit at risk. I'm going to play one more of these.
Now, nectar is made specially for the purpose, and it's costly. And there are some flowers that get away without producing nectar, like this orchid. This is a hammerhead orchid. It mimics and a wasp comes and thinks that it's a female wasp and tries to mate with it. There's a very spectacular hinge there that you'll see the use of. There are the pollen sacs, there are the pollinia, and there's the hinge, and there's the fake female. Now look what's happened. The male bee's come and been dashed onto the pollen there. It's going back and forth on that hinge, banging away. And sooner or later, the pollen sacs will come off onto his back. There he is now with his back there, and there are the pollen sacs on his back. And he flies off, and then he'll mate with another flower, and just the same thing will happen. This is a bucket orchid, an even more ingenious trick it uses. It's dropping fluid into the bucket there. This is an attractive fluid. There's a special kind of green bee which is attracted by that fluid. It comes to the flower, and it falls into the bucket. There. It's trapped there. The only way it can get out is through a special hole that's provided for it by the orchid. There's the hole. It's the only way out, and the bee has found it. It's forced out through that hole, and on its way out, there is the pollen sac waiting. So the only way through is this little passage. There are the pollen sacs, and it's going to get scraped off onto the bee's back on the way out. Now that same bee, when it finally escapes with the pollen sacs on its back, is going to fly off, and it will eventually come to another bucket orchid, and exactly the same procedure will be repeated. It'll nearly drown, it'll find the hole, and on its way out, the pollen sacs will in this case be scraped off, and they will fertilize the next orchid. So this is deceiving bees, but again using their wings to carry pollen about.
I think I think nothing will show you it as well as the video. So to be honest, I'm a liar, and we saw these are all the Stanhopeinae orchids, and they produce, interestingly, this is their lip, a part of their lip, they produce oils that are used by the euglossine bees in an aphrodisiac that helps them to attract a female. And you see there's the liquid coming out, and you can see they get drunk on this liquid, and you see the drunk lying in the bucket, and here he's emerging from the hole. So I'm going to talk just for a moment about the physiology of orchids. This is a normal flower. It's got loose pollen on anthers, and it's got the female stigma. Orchids are different. This is a typical orchid. It's got 3 petals and 3 sepals. Sepals are the covering of the bud. It's one that's specially modified with oils and sugar and guidelines, and it brings the pollinator right into the column. The column is the sexual structure, which is unique to orchids. Only milkweed has it also. And here is the fused male and female structure called a column. It's about the size of a child's pinky. This is the sticky female part, and there's a cover. When you lift the cover, you see the male part. This is what's happened to all the loose pollen that are in other flowers. It's shrink wrapped into these masses. There'll be hundreds, thousands, even millions of pollen grains all shrink wrapped together. And you get 1 pair in Phalaenopsis, 2 pairs in Cattleya, 4 pairs in what we used to call Lalias. So here's the male part, here's the female part, and there's a partition called the rostellum. And this prevents self-pollination. And you don't want self-pollination for the same reason you don't want to marry your brother. But in about 3% of orchids, if they don't get pollinated, this dries out and the pollinia bend over and they pollinate themselves. And wouldn't that be handy if, like, you know, you're 50 years old, you haven't got a boyfriend, but I digress. So this is what the pollinator pulls out. And here you have the pair of pollen. You have a strap called a stipe. And this is the sticky patch that sticks to the pollinator. And here you see it without the cap. And what happens is the bee comes into the flower. The cap is down. If he's got pollen on his head, pollinia on his head, he deposits it. He backs out. A drop of glue gets on him, and he pulls out a new set of pollinia. This is called a pollination, but that's not fertilization. Fertilization is when that pollen meets the egg. And uh, it's so rare for an orchid to actually get pollinated that they don't even have any eggs until the pollen is deposited. And then chemical signals go out and say Elvis is in the building, and the flower starts producing eggs. Where the pollen, where the pollinia has been deposited, all these pollen tubes come down. It's such a fabulous picture. It's many times magnified. These are the little tiny pollen grains, and from each pollen grain crawls down to sperm to meet the egg. And I thought it was funny because I have a niece who's a vegetarian. And I said, well, you know, I think plants are alive too. And she said, but they don't have a mother and father. But they do. Here's the father, and you're gonna get eggs, which are the mother. About a year and a half later, uh, a capsule develops. This is the fruit, and it splits open, and from out of it come thousands and thousands of seeds. Orchid seeds are like dust, and it actually, there's 1,000 times more seed in orchid than in any other plant, and they fly on the wind. Most seeds have the embryo and some food. Orchid seeds are so light and so numerous that they don't have any food, and orchids must be infected by a fungus in order for them to grow. So the orchid attracts the fungus and then eats it, and the fungus actually, the orchid actually parasitizes the fungus in order to grow. Every single orchid seedling is a parasite on a fungus. And here you see the fungus that is inside the embryo, and it will be digested. So some orchids do give nectar. About 2/3 of orchids do provide a reward. This is the very famous orchid Angraecum sexquipedale, which means 1.5 feet, and that's how long this nectary is. Somebody gave this to Charles Darwin, and he remarked very cleverly that somewhere there must be a moth, because this is white and smells at night, a moth that has a tongue that is 14 inches long, so we can reach to the bottom because the nectar is only down here. And he was the laughing stock of England. Everybody thought that was hysterical. But 40 years later, they found the moth pollinator, and they called him Xanthopan morgani predictor because Darwin predicted him. And here you have his proboscis, which fills with blood, goes all the way down here, and in the process pulls out the pollen. And here you see the moth with his proboscis all curled up. The hummingbirds also eat the nectar. There are 2 other birds that drink nectar from orchids, honey eaters and sunbirds. Now, sometimes you know what a man wants, but you don't have it. So let's say you know your man likes chesty girls and you don't have it. So you put in falsies. The man is never going to get what he came for, but sometimes the look of it is enough to get you where you want it. This is a mushroom. Fungus gnats lay their eggs in mushrooms. This is Dracula vampira. It is not a mushroom. It looks just like a mushroom. It even produces 1-octyl-3-ol, which is mushroom smell. And you see it's attracted these fungus gnats, even though it is only a trick. They will lay their eggs in here, but in the process, they'll pollinate the orchid, but they will get, and they're not going to get anything out of it. And there are many orchids that attract fungus gnats. This is Corybus diminucus from Australia. This is an orchid. It looks just like a mushroom. And here's a bunch of them on the forest floor. And although they are orchids, they look like a bunch of mushrooms to attract fungus gnats. And many of us think that these Dracula simia, they look kind of like Curious George to us. And we think, oh, isn't that so cute? But actually, what this is a mushroom mimic. And the Dracula orchids try to look like mushrooms to attract fungus gnats. Some orchids try to mimic dead things. So this is Bulbophyllum fletcherianum. It is a spectacular orchid with leaves that are 7 feet long. It has these maroon color flowers. This is the orchid. You can buy it on the web for $35, but they don't tell you that when they bloom, they stink like a herd of dead elephants in order to attract carrion flies, which are their pollinator. This is actually the fruit of that stinky orchid. It looks like a hand grenade. There are other orchids that attempt to attract carrion flies. This one is from South Africa. It's Cerium pumilum, and it smells like roadkill. And interestingly, the flower lies on the ground so that it looks like a dead thing, and it smells like death. But you see, it's successful. This insect is carrying the pollinia. One of the interesting pollination syndromes are done by all the slipper orchids like this Paphiopedilum. They produce a structure that's called a staminode. They're pollinated by syrphid flies, and syrphid flies lay their eggs in honeydew. This is actually just a little bump on this slipper orchid, but it looks like an aphid. And when an aphid feeds, from its back end comes a sugary substance called honeydew. And the syrphid fly like to lay their eggs in the sugary honeydew, which their offspring actually use to develop. So here you have the syrphid fly. He's attracted by the shininess, which looks like honeydew, the presence of the aphids. He slips off this staminode into the pouch. And here you have the fly. He's inside the orchid. They even have windows so he can see how to get out. And of course, when he gets out, he's going to go by the pollinia. And they even have hairs inside the pouch so he can use them to climb up. And you see there are the little pollinia here and the hairs that he climbs up. Another kind of deception is called food deception. And that is the orchid looks like it produces food, but it doesn't. And this was an unfortunate thing that happened to me. These are not peppermints, even though they look like it. These are soap. And I was at Christmas time in Home Depot, and there were a dish of these things, and I thought they were peppermints. And I helped myself to one of them, and I got a mouthful of soap, causing merriment at the counter, but not to me. So here you have an orchid, Epidendrum secundum, and it produces no nectar, but it blooms together at the same time and in the same vicinity as lantana and milkweed. And in the feeding frenzy, the butterfly comes over and he feeds here and he gets nectar, he feeds here, and he makes a mistake because this looks the same, but he doesn't get any nectar, but his visit causes pollination. And so blooming with other things that do produce nectar is a form of food deception. And here you see butterflies also fall for this food deception. And you see he's carrying the Epidendrum pollinia on his proboscis. And the hummingbirds also do this, fall for the trick. One of the more interesting tricks is done by this, they call it a mega-nosed fly. This was on the cover of Nature magazine. This is in South Africa. The fly is only 1 inch long, but from the front of his face, he's got this tool that he can fill with blood that's 5 inches long. And when he's not using it, it doesn't curl up, but it kind of hangs between his legs when he flies. And it's as though you had a 25-foot tongue and it would drag on the ground when you walked. It's very spectacular. Here he's carrying the pollinia from Draconis, an orchid. And he pollinates a whole bunch of different flowers in South Africa, a guild of them. Each one puts its pollen on a different part of his body. On his proboscis, he puts a Draconis. The other ones give nectar, but he goes to Draconis, which looks like the other flowers, like lilies and irises. He puts his proboscis in. It's a dry well. It's a lie. But because he usually gets nectar, he falls for the trick, but he pulls out the pollen. He is a liar. Finally, the final way that orchids attract a pollinator is with fragrance. We do this too. We spend $6 billion a year on perfume because we think that if we smell good, that someone will chew on our neck like that man is. 75% of orchids are fragrant. We can't smell most of them. We are not the intended target, and we have very bad noses. So I think it's in Australia, there are Glotis orchids, and they are pollinated by a wasp, which produces uniquely chyloglottone. These wasp females are the only thing in the world that produces chyloglottone. This orchid produces it too. And here you see that the fragrance of its female has attracted this pollinator. It's carrying pollinia, and more than one of these wasps is attracted to this fragrance. And the fragrance alone is so powerful that they put some of it on the head of a pin. And this wasp is actually trying to copulate with the head of a pin. That has the orchid fragrance, which I'm sure is a new low in his love life. Most Sobralias have fragrance, but there is one Sobralia, Sobralia amabilis, which is pollinated by a hummingbird. Hummingbirds have no sense of smell. So these orchids uniquely produce no fragrance at all, because why waste it on a pollinator who can't smell? Some of these Sobralia amabilis actually found their way to New Guinea, and hummingbirds are only from the New World. New Guinea is not in the New World, and these orchids actually reverted to having a smell in order to pollinate their pollinators in New Guinea, which can smell. Sometimes an orchid has 2 pollinators and produces 2 smells. This is the moth pollinator of Anacamptis pyramidalis, an orchid. The orchid produces 1 fragrance, which is very successful. The moth is carrying pollinia. Its day pollinator is a butterfly. It produces another fragrance for this butterfly. So it's got day and night sex fragrance, and you see this one is also carrying pollinia. One of the things that we said before is that the bumblebees and the naive bees, females will only mate once in their life, and they produce a fragrance that says after the female bee has been copulated with, it says, "Don't come near me." Once this orchid has been pollinated, it produces the exact same fragrance, and that fragrance says, "Don't come over to me." So because the orchid is producing this fragrance, the pollinator goes maybe to another flower on the same stalk, and so they don't waste the pollen. So we've talked about sexual reproduction, and one of the, today you can be a creator with a pen. You could take the pollen and put it on the stigma, and you can create the sex act for the orchid. Today, most orchids commercially are not done that way. They are cloned, and cloning is very controversial for people, but it is not controversial for orchids. And what they do is they take a small part, this is a little big, of the growing tissue of something like a cattleya, and they chop it up in a lot of little pieces, and they keep it moving, and they grow clones. They can have from one of these little growing tissue, which is really a meristematic tissue, they can grow 1,000,000 fairly exact copy of an orchid. And that's why you can get an award-winning Phalaenopsis, for example, for $10, because they can produce so many of them. And you can say, well, what's the advantage of cloning? Well, for example, Einstein was very brilliant, and he produced 3 children sexually. One of his was a daughter that no one knows what happened to. One of his sons was a chemistry teacher at a university, not as distinguished as he. And he had another son who was a schizophrenic, who was hospitalized for his whole life. So sexual reproduction did not produce an Einstein, but perhaps if we could clone Einstein, we might have 1,000,000 exact copies. I'm not pushing cloning, but this is what happens for orchids. We can make fairly exact copies of the same orchid very easily. And here you see them growing in a flask. So finally, I know that when you came here tonight, you loved orchids and you appreciated the beauty of orchids. Some of the orchids are really the Miss America of the plant world, and that's how we think of it. But I hope after our talk tonight, you realize that a lot of orchids are really just tricksters and clowns and liars and pretending to be what they are not. Some of them pretend that they are females in need of a little male companionship. Some of them pretend to be fungus, mushrooms. Some of them stink so that they attract carrion flies. Some of them produce fragrances that can drive a wasp crazy enough to actually try to copulate with the head of a pin. Some of them have ingenious things where they provide waxes that the bee will make into an aphrodisiac to attract females. Some of them pretend to be food when they're not. But I hope that you will agree with me that orchids really are the sexual superstars of the plant world. So that's the end of my show.